Dr. Ali, thank you so much for being here. It's been so much
Uh,
fun to talk to you and talk about being parents. And this episode is really going to be focused on anxiety. And I hope we have some room for hot takes and myth debunking. Let's just start out with an introduction to you and why you decided to focus on anxiety. And then, of course,
yeah,
in your social media.
yeah, Dr. Ali, thanks for having me on. This is I feel like we could spend like all day talking about this stuff. So, I'm super excited. I it is nothing in my life has been a straight path at all.
Mm.
I was not a kid that was like, one day I'm gonna grow up and become a psychologist and
Right.
then pivot to YouTube and then I'm gonna do this and that. No, 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 no. Like none of that. I was a selectively mute kid. And for people who don't know what that means, it sounds like an X-Men superpower. It is not. It is in certain situations it's like someone pressed the mute button on you.
Mm.
And I didn't realize I had this problem until I was in grad school and I started doing a group for selectively mute kids.
Oh, wow.
And my
That's
supervisor
how you
was
come out.
explaining it. I was like, oh my gosh, that was me. That was me in kindergarten. That was me in first grade. That was me in second grade. So I was a kid that would freeze in social situations that evolved into social anxiety. And then I tossed in some depression in there in middle school. And that was me. And I got to high school and I accidentally took a public speaking class.
Accidentally? How does that happen?
How does that happen?
Did you know?
My friend who sat next to me when we had to register for classes, he picked out all these classes and his older brother said, "You should take public speaking. It's a fun class." And so he took public speaking and I looked over and I'm like, "Hey dude, what are you taking?" And then he's like, "These are classes I'm taking." So I just signed up for the same stuff. I thought it was going to be a class where we sit down and we study famous public
Mm.
speeches.
Oh,
I didn't.
interesting.
Yeah, I had no idea. It was like confronting your fears of public
Could not be
speaking.
more terrifying. Yeah.
Oh, it was my biggest fear. Like, what am I doing? This is terrible. So, I tried to drop out of public speaking, and then I found out that the only way I can drop it is I would have to talk to the teacher and get her permission and have her sign this form. That terrified me.
Oh,
So I did what every anxious person does, which is somehow hope it's going to work out. Like somehow hope I'm going to be able to get out of this. The beautiful thing about that experience is Miss Georgiana Hayes, who was my teacher in that class, she structured it like a perfect behavior
mm,
experience. She was trusting, warm, collaborative, very gentle steps. She was doing a lot of stuff that we're just now catching up with. Like
right.
she wasn't doing like exposure habituation. She was really talking about like, inhibitory learning stuff. Like, what are your fears? Let's get you data about those fears from
Mm-hmm.
real world experiences. And that course completely changed my life. So to answer your question, I eventually got to college. I eventually volunteered at an OCD clinic. And that's, Dr. Ali, where everything connected. I was like, they are doing what I benefited from. I want to do more of this. Research is me search, as a lot of my supervisors have told me. And so I eventually figured out that treating anxiety, it's not just something I'm interested in. It's I think my mission in life is to help
Mm.
all those other younger Alis who went through all this stuff and that, yeah, that's kind of where I got to where I am.
Such a compelling story. And I really appreciate how open and transparent you are about your journey as a psychologist who has anxiety. I identify as someone who has anxiety, who has really gone into specialized in anxiety because of my own anxiety and how there's pros and cons to that and how it can be really beneficial. I think about facing issues head on. That's exactly what you had to do in that speech class. I mean, that's like the ultimate exposure therapy. And then having someone really warm and collaborative, right, your teacher. I've been thinking I've been thinking a lot about, I guess I'm thinking about the myths of anxiety. What are some of the things that people get wrong about anxiety, especially for folks who don't have it? I think because I have anxiety, I just assume that other people do as well. And I learned later in life that there's a lot of people who don't live their lives overthinking.
Yeah.
Just so curious about what people get wrong about it. Maybe
Well,
even the treatment.
I think you kind of nailed one of the biggest things I struggle with, which is as an anxiety professional. Not one of the biggest things I struggle with as an anxious person, although we could get into that. I could give you a big list, Dr. Holly. You have a free appointment later? Maybe I should book a slot with you. So it is the most common mental health problem among adults in the world, right? I think that is very clear. Anxiety is the most common problem. I mean, far beyond rates of autism spectrum and ADHD and depression and all of these things. Anxiety is the number one problem. Okay, so like you would think everybody gets it, everybody understands.
Right.
No, because of my life experience and because of the life experience of many of the people I work with, anxiety is often invisible. People with anxiety often slip through the cracks. We are not the ones tend to be bringing a lot of attention towards us.
Right.
In classrooms, in workplaces, the main thing that anxiety drives you to do is avoid situations, hide, freeze, the things that don't bring attention to yourself. And the main way in which it feels terrible is all the internal distress, the overthinking that you mentioned, the physical symptoms. But again, those are so invisible to everyone around us. My wife, I went through this, my son is almost 2. I went through this whole postpartum experience, and the first few months of when my son was born, I just did not feel any love towards him. I did when my daughter was born. She's almost 7. And I was going through this depression piece, but I was also going through this anxiety piece of what would people think if they knew I wasn't feeling anything towards my son, that this child psychologist person is not feeling any love towards his son. And I became so anxious about that. My wife had no idea. My wife, like, we've been together for so long. She knows how this mind works.
Right. Yeah.
She had no clue, and she had no clue because it was all happening inside. So anxiety is super common, but no one will really know you're struggling. It's very rare. Sometimes people pull away from school. Sometimes people pull away from work. I was just talking to someone earlier this week who is on a medical leave because of their anxiety. So these kind of things happen, but so many people are living at that threshold where they can get by, but they are deeply suffering, or I should say, and they can get by and they're deeply suffering. So it's invisible and extremely common. And then what ends up happening because of that, I don't know if this is your experience, Dr. Holly, but you will experience a lot of, well, just stop worrying about it. Just get over it, or I get anxious too sometimes. A lot of dismissing of anxiety from people who don't struggle with anxiety, don't understand what it's like. And that, I think, is what gets us into a lot of problems. Extremely common, however, very invisible and completely misunderstood as a result.
I love that you really touched on what anxiety is through that as well too, right? So there's a physical component that we know people aren't able to see that, right? It's rapid heart rate, it's the cognitive aspects to it, and then the behaviors, like the things we actually don't do, the things we avoid, which of course makes it worse.
Or overdo. Right?
Like, absolutely.
Overthink, reassurance, do it over and over again. All of that. That
it feels good. Like it works in the short term. If you're anxious about your health, wouldn't it make sense to go to the doctor multiple times, get multiple labs checked, and research your symptoms, and try to take all these supplements and powders, right? So one example of health anxiety, because that's something I see more common in young people. And then when you were sharing that, I was thinking about the flip side. Now that people are talking about anxiety more, and I'm thinking more about younger generations compared to even my generations, someone in their 30s, my younger clients or just friends, or I have younger siblings who will almost over identify with being anxious. It's almost
Yeah.
like that saying like, oh, I'm being so OCD when you're
Oh,
moving
yeah.
things around in your desk. It's kind of like that with anxiety. And it's almost, okay, I don't know. Maybe this is my opinion. I don't know.
Give it to me. I would. Yeah. There's something
I'm back
cool
and forth
about the
with this.
interesting coming out.
Yeah, I'm back and forth with this idea that not everything can be a trauma, or not
Oh,
everything.
yeah.
You can't be anxious about everything, or that's not anxiety. And I'm curious what you think about, are we dismissing it by talking about it too much? Are we talking about it too much? I mean, as someone who's trying to also bring more awareness to anxiety, I'm like, we talk about it enough. Are we thinking about it too much? Am I thinking about it too much? Now I'm
I love
overthinking.
that you're anxious about talking about anxiety. About like, am I doing this too much? Is this causing problem? I love
Is it
that.
making me more anxious?
Yeah. Oh, I would say all of the above is true. So when I was in grad school in the mid 2000s, Dr. Holly, I never would have thought we would be in this situation.
Mm.
Look at us, two psychologists talking about the things we work with and talking about the things we struggle with on the internet. And we're in, I'm in Northern California, you're in the Pacific Northwest.
Mm-hmm.
None of this would have ever been possible when I started my PhD in 2005. None of it.
Mm-hmm.
And the big thing that sticks out to me is us being able to disclose our own stuff and have these very honest conversations. The culture in many parts of the world, not all, and not all parts of America, but in many parts, the culture has moved incredibly towards more openness about mental health. There's still stigma there. There's still a lot of stuff we're working on. But I would have never imagined this. And I think part of that is because of the internet and communities that have formed and the norms that have shifted and some, I think, courageous celebrities, like notable people who have talked about their anxiety. All that stuff has very much helped. So that's good. I back in 2005, would have believed if I talk about my own anxiety, no patient would ever want to come see me. No other person would want to hire me, and I would get dismissed professionally. That's the culture I came into.
Right.
So all of that is good. At the same time, you said the T word, which is a big trigger for me, which is trauma. It was not meant as a trauma joke, but I guess it is one. I think we have very much lost the power and meaning of what trauma means. And I feel more concerned about trauma than I do anxiety, because anxiety is a normal, common emotion. Right. And everyone can benefit from learning the things that you and I teach. Everyone, whether you have an anxiety disorder or not. One of my favorite articles that I've ever read, it's called Rebooting Psychotherapy. And the whole premise of the article is, all right, if we could rethink everything, if we could throw out the current model of you go to see a therapist, you sit down for 50 minutes, you talk about this stuff, like if we could rebuild from scratch, what would it look like? And the authors outline a bunch of stuff. One is what you and I are doing right now, which is media, use media to help promote more public education. But one of the things that those authors talk about is this problem is so big, and there are so many people that sit just below the threshold of diagnosis. There are so many people who are struggling with anxiety, but don't meet criteria for having anxiety disorder. They need help too. One of my friends that I'm going to be seeing this weekend, he is a father to be. And he and his wife are expecting a daughter, and they've been trying for a long time and had a lot of problems. And he went from feeling like okay to now he was telling me, he's like, Ali, I am so stressed. I can't sleep. This is all that he's listing all this stuff. And I said, my friend, you are not stressed. You are struggling with anxiety. Like, and there are so many people like that who are really distressed, but probably wouldn't meet criteria, and they need help. They need
Absolutely.
help, right? So I worry less about anxiety because there's so much of it and so many people struggle
Right.
and so many people need help. I do worry about trauma because the culture there, and I think a lot of that is coming through social media. A lot of the culture has shifted towards a very broad definition of what trauma is and how it impacts you. And I think the conversation there has become really muddled and kind of confusing. And I think it might be doing more of a disservice to people who really have impairing traumatic experiences. So that's more. There's some kind of hot take there that I haven't fully formed yet, but there's something
Totally.
there. Yeah.
I mean, I like that point. But there's probably more people struggling with it than we realize, again, to that point that a lot of it is invisible. I'm thinking so much about men specifically. Maybe I think as women, we have so much more freedom, especially as new moms. We have so much more freedom to talk about the struggles that we have now than I think ever before, especially more than my own mother and her mom, where we can say, I'm so anxious about this. I'm feeling like I can't bond with my child. Does that make me a bad mom? And you get the, hey, that's normal. That actually happens. There's so much less shame now because we're talking about it. But I'm recognizing that it is behind for men, especially as new parents, especially as new fathers. And I'm currently doing my perinatal mental health certification, doing that training. And so one of our last workshops was for men's mental health and how high postpartum depression is and postpartum anxiety is for men. And yet there's so little attention on it. Men are not talking about it enough. And so I really appreciate more attention to it, especially online. I guess that leads me to think like the cultural issues, the barriers for men, but for some practical advice, what could I guess in a heteronormative relationship, what could a wife say to her husband or girl say to her boyfriend if she notices he's struggling with anxiety, but she doesn't want to come across as, motherly or a therapist, especially if you're already a therapist like myself. I mean, nobody wants their part. That's a whole nother thing. It's hard to be married to a psychologist. I will just say that.
I know. Our partners should probably have their own podcast where they, they're like, does your partner also validate you all the time, and is it also super annoying?
Yeah, it's
my wife loves to tell.
I had to take a break from validating because he was like, "What does this even mean anything to me anymore?" And then we had to talk about it. But
okay. This could be a whole thing, a whole another conversation. I do not believe we have in the heteronormative male identifying community. I don't think we have good role models about being a man. I think that has completely gone. It's completely disappeared. Yeah. So when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, gosh, that makes me sound so old. TV and politicians and leaders were the male role models. Full House was a staple of my early childhood, and Bob Saget and who's a dreamy Greek guy who sold the yogurt?
Oh, John Stamos.
Yeah.
Gosh.
He still got it. I so wanted his hair. Have mercy. Gosh, I wanted to be John Stamos. He was so cool. Still is, yeah. John Stamos and George Clooney. Those were like my. It's like I want to be like them. But I think that's kind of what I'm speaking to, is our role models of how to be a good man. What are the expectations of men? How do we deal with our feelings? They mostly came from TV, and they mostly came from a lot of the monoculture of the time. The journalists on evening news. Peter Jennings was also someone I really looked up to, like a person of integrity who stood for truth and honesty and told things the way it is. Our presidents were often role models, and regardless of where they were politically, we kind of looked up to them. As a young boy, I looked up to those people. These are the kind of people I want to be. What's happened since is like culture is so fragmented. Now there's a million cultures. There's no one show that everyone watches. And if there were a few. You look at the last few like really big shows, Squid Games, okay, no one there I want to be like. Succession, no one there I want to be like. Game of Thrones, no one there I want to be like. Curb Your Enthusiasm. And I'm also naming shows that are like like more popular with older millennials and Gen X and stuff like that. Like there's so much fragmentation, and then okay, so who are the celebrities now? YouTubers, I guess. And there's TikTok. Again so many niche silos. There isn't like one person people look up to. So I think for a lot of cisgender hetero men, there's no one to look up to, and politics is completely polarized now. So that's a problem. And I think that's why people like Jordan Peterson are so popular. Here is a man who is giving a philosophy to a lot of young boys about how to live your life. And I think that really resonates with a lot of boys who are lonely and isolated. And I disagree with Jordan Peterson on so much stuff. And I also recognize the value he's giving to this community.
Yeah, that's well said.
So that's a big problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just learned, or I didn't learn this, but I thought it was so fascinating with algorithms, with TikTok, with Instagram, that we're not seeing the same things when we open up our phones. We have all these options when watching whatever reality TV show we're into at the time, when we open up YouTube, but what shows up on our Explore pages is different for everyone. If I looked at my sister, who's my twin sister, who we really like a lot of the same things, we get such different exposures to different celebrities or things or topics, and it's fascinating. And that way, I love that answer that we really got to have better role models, and not even, for our children who are growing up too, but for adults of today. And integrity is a really fascinating thing because that's changed a lot too. But men who can be really open about their mental health struggles, that's a really big shift. So I appreciate the work you've done there.
Well, can I say one thing that I think is really important for anxiety as it presents among men? So we talk about fight or flight or freeze a lot when it comes to anxiety, that people will often want to avoid situations, or they'll feel frozen like I did when I had selective mutism, or they'll prepare themselves for fighting. I think I have yet to meet many anxious people who get anxious and then they start a fight. However, I just,
I'm gonna fight you.
Yeah. The common example is like, okay, a lion chases you and like you're getting ready, like I never see that. What I see all the time though, in myself and among many men that I work with, is many of us, when we get anxious, we feel like a caged lion. So when you are a lion and you are trapped in a cage, you can't escape, you can't fight. So what do? You roar. You roar. And you try to push other people away. You can't get to safety yourself. You can't escape that cage. But maybe I can intimidate other people, get a little bit distance, get a little bit of space. That, I think, is, you're asking like what can people say to other people, to men who might be anxious? I think the first thing is just to recognize there's a possibility the person you love is not just being an asshole, but they are incredibly scared. When my anxiety presents at home, well, I should back up. When I'm anxious about stuff, I will usually avoid the outside world, not talk about it, bite my lip, come home, and then get through the evening with my kids, and then I'll be an asshole at night. And then I have to realize, oh my gosh, I'm being an asshole right now because I am so anxious about this thing. I need to talk to my wife about this. And for better or worse, in heteronormative relationships, most of the time, the only people that men feel comfortable talking to are their female partners. And they're the only source of emotional support. A lot of the social support, the getting help with the struggles you're going through, a lot of it, usually heteronormative men get that through their partner. So I think the first thing is recognizing that anxiety might look different for men, and it might present differently, and it might present as roaring, as anger, as trying to push people away to get a little bit of safety. And that is very different than a lot of traditional ways in which anxiety is presented in the public.
That was so helpful for me. I could talk about this forever, trying to analyze it, especially with my sister, trying to understand my own partner even more. And that was gold. But even if nobody listens to this, and that has changed me. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask you about other topics in psychology and mental health before we wrap up. What are your thoughts on AI? That's such an open-ended question. Overall, man, it has so much potential to revolutionize so many things in our world. There's pros and cons. But mental health specifically, I'm curious what your take is on ChatGPT and using it to assess anxiety. Or I really like Hello Pi, if you've heard of that. There's another one that helps with CBT. Hello Pi is what I used during my postpartum depression to just like vent on how I'm doing. But I started recognizing that reminder that this is not a human, because it was like a template. It's like, oh, I hear what you're going through, Holly. That sounds really stressful and sad. It was kind of the same stuff. And I was like, it actually made me want to see my therapist more. And I went back to therapy during that time. But so curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I'm a big sci-fi nerd, and my pathway to psychology was actually through Star Trek. So
I remember that.
I fell in love with science fiction because science fiction asks all these questions about humanity, like what would humans do in these situations. And then I took an intro psych class, and I was like, oh my gosh, this field has those answers. They have answers to all the questions that science fiction raises. So for me, AI has been this big thing, like from 2001: A Space Odyssey and all these movies and TV shows and books, right? So I've kind of been like excited and nervous about this moment my whole life. And now it's here. And like so many things in science fiction that arrived, they're not as cool or as scary as the science fiction story versions. We have like hoverboards in Back to the Future 2 were really cool. And then we got these hoverboards, but they're pieces of junk. Like they were, and they were banned because the batteries were exploding and all that stuff. So like, the reality is never as cool as science fiction. And I think the same is true of a lot of AI we have right now. I think there's a lot of fear from everyone about what this means, probably because of science fiction.
That's true.
What we have now is nowhere near what we've seen in movies. What we have now is mostly these algorithms that are very good at predicting what word should come next with a lot of the language models and a lot of the image generation. The algorithms are very good at predicting what should be the next pixel, like what should be the next thing that's drawn.
Right.
So I think if you think about it like that, it's like, okay, this is what the AI right now is very good at. How can it help me? How can I, because I think AI by itself, it's not going to replace all these things, because it's not actually, it's very good at reproducing stuff we've already done. So a lot of the stuff that just purely comes out of AI is kind of boring. It's not that interesting. It's not novel. But AI and humans, I think, are really cool. So I've spent a lot of time experimenting with it, and I do a lot of content creation. So one of the things that I do is I'll write out a script, or I'll write an article, and then I'll feed that to AI, and I'll say, like, what are the most boring parts? What can I cut out? What's the most memorable part? What's the most interesting part? How can I make this part shorter? And for me, it's kind of like working with an editor.
Absolutely.
And this AI is just kind of like pressure testing my ideas. So I use it a lot in the editing phase, and I also sometimes use it in the idea generation phase, where I'm looking for an idea of something to write about or some video to create. It's often like 90% of the time it gives me boring ideas, but 10% of the time it gives me something I haven't thought about. So that's one thing where I would think about is how can you coexist with it, and how can you start using it now so you're not anxious about it, because it is rapidly changing, rapidly developing. So start learning how this tool can live with you. Like, like for teachers, I don't know if there's any teachers listening. I think one of the best things you can do is this is not an original idea from me. It's something I've seen shared in a lot of communities I'm in, but assign your students to have ChatGPT write an essay on a topic, bring in that essay, and then pressure check it in class with what you actually know, like what's right, what's wrong, how can this be improved. Like that's just one example of how we can weave in these technologies into our work and get people learning how they work, how they function, how can we coexist with them. From a practice standpoint and from a mental health standpoint, getting back to that idea of so many people are struggling, I think we need many new solutions. Like it's not, here's another thing I deeply believe is most people will never be able to access a qualified expert in the mental health issue that they are struggling with. It's just not going to happen. Well, there's not enough therapists. There's too many barriers from access, from location, from wait lists, from stigma, from cost, from insurance companies being terrible. So most people are not going to be able to access someone like you and I. It's not going to happen. So what else can we do that helps people? And I think AI is one thing that can be a solution for a lot of people, even if it's just like a self-guided thing. Like, here's some things you should try by yourself. And if this doesn't work, then maybe you can look into a group. And if this doesn't work, maybe you can look into an expert. Like doing more tiered support here, I think is going to be great. And then as a provider, it's really helpful with writing notes, like paperwork. You know, it's
Absolutely.
That is what it's kind of designed for, is predicting what word should come next. And that is one of the biggest hurdles and just totally like time killers in our work, is all the paperwork we have to do. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff. And my main advice is don't avoid it. We don't want fight, flight, or freeze. We want to understand it and learn how it works and how it can coexist.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of folks who fear it, especially people in my field. I've talked about it in a group chat with my colleagues, and it's amazing how divided we were on it. I'm definitely maybe too optimistic about it. And then remembering too, like, just like the excitement of the hoverboards or even self-driving cars. Like, we thought self-driving cars were going to, I knew, like, growing up, I assumed I would never have to learn how to drive because my father told me, hey, by the time you're 16, there will already be self-driving cars. Like, the technology is there. And that just, didn't happen. And so in a way, it's one of those things of, if I don't learn it now, what am I going to? This is really the time, I think, if for any professional to really be able to use it to your advantage, so it makes you a better clinician. And then kind of helping with that, with educating about it. And then again, there's a lot of ethical considerations. I think that's a topic for another day. But overall, I think it's a good thing, but we'll see. I guess time will tell.
To make myself sound old again, like, I remember when the internet was, the World Wide Web, this version, right? Like the mid 90s is when a lot of that became more available. And in the late 90s, businesses were like, we need an internet strategy. Like, we have to exist. Something. We need a website. We need a web page. This internet's going to change everything. And it hasn't. It hasn't. Like, now, like, more than 20 years, like 25 years later, the internet is just a part of everything we do.
Right.
It's a part of every business. Like, every business has a web page. Every business has email. But there's plenty of businesses that are, like, you still have restaurants, like you still have this place that you go to and you do things in person. And some businesses have been totally turned upside down, and Amazon has completely changed everything. But like, some things haven't changed. Like, schools haven't changed that much. So everyone now, there's no one has like an internet strategy. It's just something that's there. And I think 10, 15, 20 years from now, it's going to be the exact same thing with AI. No one's going to be like, oh my God, AI has changed everything. Everyone's going to be like, well, is this kind of there? And yeah, some things it's changed, but a lot of things it hasn't. It's just going to be one more ingredient in how we do our work, just like email and just like web pages.
I am talking to you. I know that my listeners, and I'll have this uploaded too, or I will put the link so be able to find you, specifically your strategies for anxiety. And so last question of the show is what is the one thing, or maybe it's a couple things that you wish more people knew about anxiety?
So I have been thinking this is the first time I'm going to be sharing this idea
Okay.
with especially another colleague and more publicly. But I've spent like the last year and a half kind of like working on this book and trying to condense everything I know about anxiety into this one small thing.
So excited.
Yeah, I'm excited for it to be done.
I bet.
It's not there yet, but I'm tentatively, the book is, who knows if the publisher will use this title, but it's tentatively called the Anxious Psychologist's Guide to Living with Fear. That's kind of the thing. But the main idea I've come up with is that, Dr. Holly, everything that means anything gets back to the present moment. Like, the only thing we are guaranteed is this moment right now. We have no idea what's going to come next. We might worry about it, but if you're like me, most of your worries end up being really strange and don't really come true. And the stuff that you do have to deal with, the real crises, are things you never really worried about. You know, like I could go on and on about all the stuff I worried about with my kids, but didn't come true. The stuff that I have as a challenge I never expected, right? So the only thing that really means anything is the present moment. And the way we overcome all of our barriers are through the present moment. The way we learn about our fears is by opening up the flow to the present moment. That's how exposure therapy works. And so the thing I want people to do is when they're struggling when they're in a worry spiral, and the focus goes all inside on what's happening in your brain. The focus goes all on your body, the anxious symptoms. You gotta ask yourself, what can I do right now to get back to the present moment, to take my intention from being inside and turning it out? I think that is anxiety treatment in a nutshell. And I'm not talking about just like mindfulness. I don't think mindfulness works for people who struggle with rumination and worries. It makes you worry more, makes you ruminate more. It is about asking yourself, what can I do to bring my attention from internal to external, to the present moment? Maybe that's about self-soothing, grounding, emotion regulation skills. Maybe it's about finding a way to get unstuck with your thoughts. Maybe it's about writing and worry time. Maybe it's about finding ways to corrupt the compulsions that you might be experiencing. Maybe it's about exposure and opening up the flow of information to this thing that you fear. So it's not just, you're not just basing it on all the things you worry, but you're basing it on what actually happens, right? But that's the critical question. How can I turn my attention back to the present moment? So right now I'm putting all this stuff together. I'm going to be launching a website. It's live right now, but it's not 100%. All the content is there, but backtothepresent.com is the big area where I'm going to be putting all these thoughts together. And yeah, it'll be on my YouTube stuff too, but backtothepresent.com is where I'm going to be pushing this stuff. So that's my big idea. That's what I just ask yourself that. What can I do to get back to the present moment right now?
And I appreciate you saying that it's not all just mindfulness and it doesn't work for everyone. I mean, yes, we can all take a deep breath and there's a lot of somatic things and all that's really important. But I think the empowering part is knowing that there are a lot of different options and you will be able to find something that works for you. That's just how it works. As humans, we are more resilient than we realize. And I think that's why it's really helpful to have a therapist while kind of coming up with your strategy. Maybe the strategies that ChatGPT just gave you, but what is it for you that works, right? Because we're unique individuals. I know our time is up and I just so honored to have you on our show and meet you, especially after watching your videos when I was a first year PhD student in Northern California, and just amazed that someone was able that you were sharing your own experiences with anxiety and as a psychologist. Your article maybe it was on Medium while you left while you left Columbia. Is that
It
where you're
was
working at?
I
Was it before?
quit being a therapist so I could become a better husband. It was something like that.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
took it
yeah.
to my sister. My sister took some time from school after she got married and she returned. I admire her for it now. The time I didn't, and then my burnout came out later. It was during the pandemic, right after
Oh yeah,
during my
yeah.
postdoc. So you have changed so many lives. I know you
Oh,
hear this already, but you have changed my own. And thank you so much for being on the show.
oh, it's my
Um,
pleasure. It's my
it's me.
pleasure. It's a rare privilege to be able to talk with someone who I respect and admire and talk about something we so are passionate about. So thank you for that, and thank you for having this show and this conversation and keeping it going. We could spend so much time talking about this stuff, but I know our time is
Seriously.
limited.
Yeah.
But thanks for having me.
Thank you. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for your support. Stay kind. Have a good day. Bye bye.